Welcome to the deep dive. We're really glad you shared this material with us. Today, we're diving into a time in India's history, often called its darkest hour. It's definitely complex, quite turbulent, and the sources you gave us suggest it still casts a long shadow.
Absolutely. We've been digging through this stack of articles and notes you provided, all centered on the emergency in India, specifically between 75 and 77. So our goal here is to really unpack what went down, why it happened, and why it still resonates so much. Even today in 2025, it feels like a specter almost.
It really does. Like looking back at a moment where Indian democracy itself was, well, pushed to the absolute limit. So let's get into it. What set the stage for this?
Okay, let's paint the picture based on these sources. Think about India in the early 1970s. It's still a relatively young democracy, finding its feet after independence, juggling huge national aspirations with the tough realities of a developing country.
And the sources paint a picture of significant challenges, don't they? The economy sounds like it was really struggling.
Oh, definitely. High inflation hitting hard, unemployment a major issue, lots of strikes happening across the country. It was a tense economic climate.
And wasn't there the fallout from the 1971 war?
Exactly, the Bangladesh Liberation War. Strategically, a big win for India, no doubt. But the material shows it came at a huge financial cost, putting even more strain on the economy.
So you've got this kind of boiling pot, economic problems, social unrest, and politically things were heating up too.
They really were. You can see in the sources how the opposition parties, and it was a really diverse mix back then, ideologically all over the place. They were starting to effectively tap into that public frustration and gain real momentum.
And then came this specific moment, June 1975, that the sources pinpoint as the catalyst.
Yeah, that's the Allahabad High Court verdict, June 12, 1975. It found the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, guilty of electoral malpractices.
From her 1971 campaign, right? What kind of malpractices are we talking about? Sounds serious.
It was serious. The sources mentioned things like using government officials, government resources for her election campaign. Things that, well, fundamentally compromised the fairness of the process, according to the court.
Okay, and what was the potential fallout for her?
Well, the big one was she could be unseated from parliament, barred from holding office. So naturally, this just blew up into a massive political crisis.
Yeah.
The opposition smelled blood. Their calls for her resignation got incredibly loud.
And leading that charge, we see this figure, Jayaprakash Narayan JP.
JP really became the moral center of that movement. He was this respected, older figure, kind of Gandhian background, and the forces describe him as truly inspiring people. He put out this call for total revolution.
Total revolution. That sounds huge. What did that actually mean on the ground?
It wasn't violent revolution. The sources describe it more as a broad, nonviolent push for deep systemic change. He mobilized students, workers, farmers. Huge protests started happening, demanding real reform, accountability.
Right. So you have the court verdict, this growing movement led by JP, widespread protests. How did Indira Gandhi react to all this pressure?
This is the crucial pivot point the material focuses on. Instead of stepping down or, trying to find a compromise, she took this really drastic, unexpected route. Late on the night of June 25, 1975, she advised the president to declare a national state of emergency.
June 25th, citing internal disturbances.
Exactly, using Article 352 of the Constitution. And what's striking in the sources is how it felt like someone just flipped the switch on democracy overnight. That article was meant for, like, war or armed rebellion, using it for internal disturbances.
Yeah.
Well, our sources suggest it was legally shaky, but politically decisive. The whole atmosphere just changed. Fear, control, yeah, paranoia too.
Okay, so the switch is flipped June 25th. What did that mean, practically? For ordinary folks, for the country's functioning, how did it unfold?
The impact was, well, immediate and sweeping. Civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, basically vanished, suspended, just gone overnight.
And information. The press. How quickly was that controlled?
Instantly. The press was a primary target. Heavy censorship came down. Government officials literally sitting in newspaper offices, reading copy before it went out, making sure nothing critical got published.
That's genuinely chilling. Was there any pushback from the press? Any way to resist subtly?
Yeah, there were these incredible moments of quiet defiance highlighted in the sources, like in Delhi when the government cut the power to newspaper offices, obviously, to stop them printing some papers, published editions with their editorial columns completely blank.
A blank space saying everything. Powerful.
Absolutely. Speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the courage there.
So beyond silencing the press, what about the opposition leaders? JP, others like him.
A huge crackdown, immediately. Big names, JP, Moraji Desai, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, so many others just rounded up and arrested very quickly.
And was it just the famous politicians, or was it broader? What was the scale?
No, that's the thing. The scale described in the sources is pretty staggering. We're talking reports of over 100,000 people detained during the emergency. And the main legal tool was this act called MISA, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act.
Miesa. The sources we read called it pretty vague.
Very vague. It existed before, but during the emergency, it was basically weaponized. Its vagueness meant people could be locked up without trial for almost anything deemed dissent. So you had political leaders sharing cells with student activists, journalists, anyone who voiced opposition.
Right. So freedom's gone, opponents jailed. But the government also had its own agenda, didn't it? This 20-point program.
Correct. They launched this 20-point program. It focused on things like literacy, land reforms, family planning. On the surface, a development push. But the sources suggest it was also partly about projecting an image of progress, maybe distracting from the clampdown on rights.
And one part of that, family planning, became really infamous, didn't it?
Yes. This is where Sanjay Gandhi, the prime minister's son, comes in quite significantly and, frankly, disturbingly. He became the major force behind this massive nationwide sterilization campaign.
Forced sterilization. The term itself implies coercion.
Completely.
Mm.
The material details how much coercion was involved. Men, particularly from poorer, marginalized communities, were targeted.
Mm.
And the numbers are just mind-boggling. Over 6 million sterilizations reportedly carried out in just 1 year during the emergency.
6 million in a year. Forced procedures. It's hard to even comprehend that level of state intrusion.
It really is. And there's this anecdote in the sources that just captures the grim reality stories of people going for something totally routine, like getting a ration card, and basically being forced into sterilization, leaving with a surgical scar they never consented to. It shows how deep that state power reached.
So on one side, you have this immense unchecked state power, suspending rights, jailing dissenters, pushing these brutal policies. What about the other side, the people? Let's talk about the individuals, those in power and those who resisted.
Well, at the top, Indira Gandhi. The sources paint her as complex, charismatic, definitely, but also described as shrewd, maybe ruthless, and very protective of her power. She framed the emergency publicly as necessary medicine, for stability.
And she had her loyalists, and crucially, her son Sanjay.
Sanjay Gandhi became incredibly influential during this time, even without an official government post initially. The sources really emphasize his role in driving policies like the slum demolitions and especially that sterilization drive, often with what's described as a real disregard for the human cost.
So power, very concentrated, few checks. But there was resistance. Who were the key figures standing against this?
Jayaprakash Narayan, JP, really stands out as the symbol. The sources portray him as physically frail by then, but with this incredible moral authority that inspired so many to defy the government. He became this unifying figure for people fighting to get democracy back.
Was the resistance just from famous leaders, or did it go deeper?
Oh, much deeper. We found accounts of amazing courage from ordinary people, these underground networks. Activists risking everything to print and secretly distribute pamphlets, organizing tiny, hidden protests, just keeping lines of communication open when everything official was shut down. They kept that spirit alive.
And the press, even under censorship, found ways.
They did. Beyond the blank editorials, papers like the Indian Express, the Statesman, are mentioned for being clever. Using allegory, quoting literature in ways readers would understand as criticism. It was this subtle, brave, intellectual resistance. Required real wit.
How did this all land on the average person, away from Delhi, in the towns and villages?
That's crucial. The sources stress this wasn't just some high-level political drama. The emergency's impact was felt very deeply across the country. Farmers, laborers, ordinary families were dealing with the economic hardship and the direct impact of state repression. Those sterilization camps, the fear of bulldozers clearing slums, these weren't abstract things. They were real threats in villages and cities alike.
Any specific stories of resilience that stood out?
Yeah, the sources mentioned small acts of everyday bravery. People hiding activists from the police, someone smuggling banned leaflets hidden under vegetables, or just that quiet, stubborn refusal by many to be completely cowed. These small things, collectively, showed the democratic spirit was still there under pressure.
So the emergency tightens its grip, resistance bubbles up, the country is profoundly changed. How did it finally end? What shifted?
Well, by early 1977, it seems the sources suggest that public patience, despite all the control, was just wearing incredibly thin. The mood underground was shifting.
And then Indira Gandhi made a surprising move, a gamble, really.
A huge gamble, yeah. Maybe she believed her own propaganda, thought she'd restored order and still had support. Whatever the reason, she stunned everyone by calling for general elections in January 1977.
And it backfired spectacularly.
Completely. The result was a massive rejection of the emergency. The Janata Party, this coalition, literally forged out of the opposition groups she'd suppressed and jailed, swept to power.
Driven pretty much entirely by that anti-emergency feeling.
Overwhelmingly. The defeat for her Congress party was huge. The sources note their seats in the Lok Sabha crashed from around 350 before, down to just 154 in 77, a decisive verdict.
Okay, so the country votes out the emergency. What did the new Janata government do first?
Their mandate was clear: undo the emergency. They immediately lifted it, released the political prisoners, restored freedom of the press, and got to work trying to put democratic institutions back on track.
And did they try to prevent something like this from happening again? Legally?
Yes, that was important. We found they passed a major constitutional amendment designed specifically to make declaring an emergency much harder in the future, putting in more safeguards around Article 352.
So democracy wakes up, maybe a bit groggy, as one source put it, but alive. What was the lasting impact of those 21 months?
It definitely left scars, no question. It showed how fragile India's democracy could be, how quickly rights could disappear with unchecked power. But interestingly, the sources also point to a kind of paradoxical effect, which it seems to have created a much stronger political awareness among ordinary citizens. Having actually lived through the loss of rights, people became much more conscious of those rights and the need to be vigilant about protecting them. A harsh lesson? Maybe. But one that arguably strengthened the democratic commitment long term.
That makes a lot of sense. You don't appreciate something until it's gone, right? Which brings us to now, 2025. Why does this period, 75 to 77, still feel so relevant?
Our sources really hammer this home. The emergency isn't just history. For India's democracy, even after all this time, it serves as this vital cautionary tale.
And how does that specter, as you put it, pop up today?
Well, you see concerns about, let's say, authoritarian tendencies arise whenever there are perceptions of governments trying to curb media freedom, or using laws that seem maybe overly broad or vague, or cracking down too hard on dissent or protests.
The sources mentioned debates around recent laws, sometimes triggering these comparisons.
Exactly. Things like the Citizenship Amendment Act, or the farm bills, the material notes, that discussions around these sometimes brought up fears of emergency-like situations. We saw a reference to a 2019 editorial expressing concern that tactics against protesters felt worryingly familiar, potentially endangering democratic norms.
So the memory acts like an alarm bell, a sensitivity.
It really does. And the flip side is that period also reminds us about resilience. It showed that even under extreme pressure, collective resistance can make a difference.
How does today's information landscape, social media and all that, compare to the censored press back then?
That's a really interesting point the sources touch on. Social media is seen as this double-edged sword. On one side, yes, it can be used to spread misinformation or drown out voices, acting like a new kind of censorship in a way. But on the other, it gives people powerful tools to organize, amplify voices, and bypass traditional controls in ways that were just impossible in 1975.
So potential for both control and liberation.
Precisely. And I think the main takeaway, the thing that really jumps out from all this material, is that democracy isn't something you just achieve and then it stays there. It needs constant work, active protection. It requires vigilance from everyone.
So the message is stay aware, question things, be ready to stand up for your rights. Maybe keep that idea of a blank editorial handy, metaphorically speaking.
That's exactly the spirit, being an engaged citizen. And remembering the specifics helps ground it. June 25, 1975, Article 352, internal disturbances, over 100,000 arrests, that horrific sterilization peak in 76, the massive electoral defeat in 77. These aren't just abstract historical facts, they were real, painful events.
Absolutely. Knowing those details really brings home the gravity and the relevance.
What's powerful is seeing how those facts from the past directly feed into the caution and the debates happening right now. It connects directly.
Well, this deep dive certainly took us through a really challenging, critical period in India's story, a time when its democracy faced, arguably, its biggest test.
Definitely a period that serves as a potent reminder of how precious and sometimes precarious freedoms can be, and why vigilance is just non-negotiable.
And understanding it isn't just looking back, it's vital for appreciating the journey since then and the continuous effort needed to protect those core democratic values.
As the sources imply, these historical specters, they don't just evaporate, they linger.
And without that constant awareness, that vigilance, there's always that underlying risk, isn't there, of facing similar challenges again?
Maybe even, as one source darkly hinted, starring in the sequel.
A chilling thought to end on. Thank you for bringing this material to us and for joining us on this important deep dive into the emergency in India.
It was definitely a crucial period for us to explore together. Thank you.